Construction. What do I mean by that? Construction is the artistic principle that if you can think of something as a three-dimensional object, you can basically construct anything in the world out of a handful of simple shapes. You got the sphere, you got the cone, you've got the cylinder, and of course, the almighty cube. Now, obviously, these are interpretable. So, for instance, this cube here, what if I had something that was like a long, flat cube? Is it still a cube? Yeah. A matchstick, it's just a cube. What about something that's egg-shaped or even avocado-shaped? Maybe it's something like this. Is this a sphere? Yeah, I just think of it as like a squishy, elongated sphere. We're going to talk about a number of ways that construction works, but first let's just start with these hand-eyeballed ones. They're kind of in perspective, but I'm just pulling it out of my mind. And we'll get into what led me to these conclusions, but first just I want you to notice these ideas of contour. Imagine I drew lines that went along here. So for instance, here on this cylinder, there's lines that are radiating around it like this. Similarly on this cube, maybe there's lines like this. So these are called contours, and they help us to understand the way that forms are wrapping around things. And I want you to practice drawing these on stuff, even if it means you're ruining your drawing because you're drawing right on top of things. Oh no, but again, like a lot of times you don't know how to draw because you haven't drawn the scaffolding that would explain the concepts you need to know to understand how to draw. And so you have to give yourself permission to make these little messes all over the place. So for instance, if I was to go back to this avocado one, let's imagine there's a center line here. These contour lines are something that are really, really helpful in a number of capacities. But you can see how I'm explaining why this sphere exists in a certain place, you know? So if I can draw these contours, it really helps because you can do something like, imagine a snake, right? I love drawing a snake-like thing because it's really just a series of cylinders over and over. And the contours are going to tell me which way this snake is turning. So right now, these little U's and N's and C's are telling me that this is going this way. Because really, this chunk here is like saying there's a cylinder right there. So if I want it to curve upward, I go like that. What if I want it to curve towards us? Well, this currently is a contour going like that, describing that this one here is a cylinder going this way, right? But if I wanted something to start coming towards me, I maybe need to start having those go in a different direction. So contours help us understand the way that simple shapes are turning in space. And you see this all the time. Right now you can see it based on my shirt sleeve, which way my arm is going. When it goes up like this, this sleeve is now going under me like a little smiley face. So you can see that my arm is pointing up. When it's pointing down, this curve, or if I was pointing like this tells you that my arm is pointing away from you. Where do we get these 3D shapes? Well, we do have some perspective that we can look at. One point perspective is the easiest one. I'm just going to draw this single point in space. And we're also going to draw a straight line here that represents our horizon. I'm not using any rulers. You can use a ruler if you want. I love starting this by having radiating lines come out everywhere from this, because it helps you just know immediately where the perspective is. But down here, this is 1 point perspective, which assumes that everything is parallel or perpendicular to the line of sight. We'll get into perspective more later on. But just imagine I have some sort of cube here. Since it's parallel to this, it would be coming straight up and straight down. Now the lines over here are receding towards this. They go back like that, and like that. And now that I've got this done in red pencil, or red pen, I could go in and refine it with my finishing medium. So 1 point perspective, I just want to always think about this in a couple of ways when I do 1 point perspective. Number one, this starting face of the cube is a simple two-dimensional shape because it's flat and coming right towards us. It's the equivalent of a piece of paper here that is oriented directly towards the camera. It's technically in perspective, but it's perpendicular to your line of sight, and so as a result, it doesn't really seem to have any perspective distortion. When I go like this, it starts having these lines fade off into the vanishing point off in the distance, which is this like little dot right here, right? 2 point perspective is instead something that is at a 45-degree angle. So for instance, if I have 2 points like that, and once again, I'm going to do radiating lines everywhere. So this is 2 point perspective, and there's lines coming all over like this. So these two lines can also have a horizon. So if I pick literally any sort of point right here and just draw a line down, this is that forward edge of this cube here. And now we have this cube in 2 point perspective. There's lots of demos on how to set up these grids if you really want to use grids, but there's also diminishing returns on it, I think. One thing to note is like, look at these angle changes. The further towards the edge of the picture plane, like if this is a picture plane here, the further towards the edges, in other words, the closer it is to us, the more extreme this perspective distortion gets. This is like a 90-degree angle. Whereas back here, the closer it gets to the horizon, the flatter it gets. In fact, I love doing this as an explanation for cylinders. You don't need to draw a perspective, but just imagine you have a pancake here, and it's getting flipped in the air. Right now, it's directly on the horizon, so there's literally nothing to see. But as it goes above the horizon, we would see a little bit of the underside of that pancake. And up here, we would see a little more. And then a little more. And similarly below it, as we go down, we're going to see more and more distortion on the other end. And so this is just something to note, which is closer to you is more extreme. Towards the horizon, you have this change in perspective where down here, here's this plane. At some point, as it comes up, it's eye level and it's totally flat. Above, you see more of it. Below, you see more of it. And the further away it gets up and down, the more that extremity is going to happen. I bring this up because of just a natural problem that students have oftentimes when you tell them, why don't you just draw from imagination using construction, which is, I call it the coffee cup formula. The least perspective-y thing that can possibly exist would be an isometric drawing like this, where every line is totally parallel. So the lines marked 0 are all parallel to each other. The lines marked 1 are all parallel to each other. And the lines marked 2 are all parallel to each other. This is like something you would see in a video game like Pokemon or Final Fantasy back in the day. Something where it's technically 3D, but we're taking the perspective distortion out. And what ends up happening is the opposite of this. I sometimes refer to this as the coffee cup theory, which is I see students turn in these kind of drawings. I say, draw whatever you want. And they say, okay, I'll draw whatever's in front of me, which is this cup of coffee I'm drawing. And I see these kind of drawings. It's like, there's their coffee cup. And what's happened here is they're doing the opposite of perspective, which is they're drawing the information of the idea first, which is the coffee in the coffee cup. And then they wonder, why does this suck? Why does this look bad? I don't know. So imagine, if you will, that instead we have a simple cube. So there's my horizon. Now this top face is closer to the horizon. This front angle is closer to the horizon, so it should have more distortion. And as it comes down, this simple cube is going to have more distortion. And you can infer the sort of vanishing points that I'm drawing here when I do this. And it's one of the nice things about practicing construction. Do consider it practice. It's a muscle. It's not knowledge. You have to practice it to know it. But within this, you can see that we have this more distortion here and less distortion up there, just like we talked about previously over here. So what if I put a cylinder inside of this? Well, here's this bottom plane. You can imagine a circle shape being inside of this perspective square, and then it goes up. And now we have this much more accurate coffee cup, because we can see that the plane of the coffee existing is actually closer to the top here. And therefore is going to be flattened as we get closer to this. I do want you to build the muscle memory of just doing this without thinking about it. Like, don't draw the grids. Try and just be able to pull shapes out of nowhere. So like, this is another one to consider. And again, I'm trying to not move my hand. I'm trying to move my whole arm. But try making some simple ellipses. It starts soft, and then I can draw harder when I've decided I like my rough draft, One of the things people recommend against is watch out for football points with your ellipses, which is like that. These points where it's too sharp are going to make it look incorrect. And as I tilt it, it'll get thinner and thinner, or as I squash this closer to the horizon, these do get thinner and thinner, but really these corners do not turn into football points. So that's how you make a coffee cup. Let's just think about some of these basic shape things. Why do we need construction? And why should you practice it? Well, eventually everything is kind of construction at some point. So let's try and draw something a little more complex out of construction, just to see how it might be used. So for me, it's always the face. Sorry. So imagine, if you will, that you have a simple cube. And we put a head inside of this. Well, if you draw an X through any given plane of this, you can find the center point of this. And that tells you how this center point would go further along here. And you'll notice there's some spatial differentiation that happens with this. There's a lot more space taken up by the area of this plane that is closer to you than the part that is farther away from you. Similarly, if I keep just inferring these perspective lines, that gives you something like that. So when I draw a human face, it's kind of like an egg. This is called gesture drawing, where I'm making a fast, quick rendered sketch. But this idea of construction is something that is very helpful with drawing, because the head is kind of a sphere. It's kind of a cube, but then it just has more geometry on top of it. So your nose, for instance, is this sort of pyramid shape. Your chin might have a little bump here. This is called shape welding when you start taking these shapes and putting them together, including the idea that, like, for this eye socket, think of an ice cream scoop coming in and slurping that eyeball out. And now you have this cavity where the eye used to be. So this is where I love contours and construction. Let's say I just want to understand this drawing more. I can think through a lot of my problems here. So I've got this front edge of my brow, but imagine I drew a center line. A center line is a really handy line to trace. I can go along there. There's the center line of my nose. It comes down. We're not going to see this because this underside of the nose is blocking it. But then it would come there for the upper lip, inward for going into your mouth. Your bottom lip comes out and down. And then there's your chin. So this chin is kind of a cube that's attached to this other cube, right? The nose is kind of a cone, or maybe you could think of it as a trapezoidal cube, where it's like, that's how those faces work. Even this, the brow, you could think of as a big shape. The cheekbone, maybe it's a sphere, maybe it's a cube. But in this sense, we slowly get all these things constructed. Even the mouth, this might seem like a harder one, but I love showing this with mouths. Imagine, if you will, that you have a donut, and then somebody squashes the donut. So now it's more like this shape. And then you curve it in space, like this a little bit. And so we're starting with, oh, I guess we do have one more. Well, is a ring technically a new, or a torus a new shape, or is it just a cylinder that's been twisted around, you know? I don't know. So if I had this rotating in space, I'm going to draw this in red first, and then I'll trace over it. Doing a little bit of something like that. So if I had this going like that, you could imagine this being a donut that is squashed, and now these radiating lines are going up and around. And then you shape weld by making this slowly blend into the nearby shapes, you know? And all this construction, by the way, means that later on you can use it for shading purposes, because it's just tracing it, or it's just like figuring out where these light sources are going to be at that point. All these shapes now, for any given one of them, I could say I want it shaded on the bottom. And therefore, as this one curves away from the light, it would have lines there. This is entirely in shadow. And lit from the left. I want you to note, by the way, that when I'm rendering these, we're trying to like show some sort of shading algorithm for them. I'm not just filling in the blanks. I'm not just being like, okay, this cube is on this side. That sucks. Don't do that. I'm trying to modify my hand position so that when I do this hatching motion, I'm doing it along the contours. I'm describing the contours as I go. And that gives your viewer just a little more visual information about what you're trying to get across here. So going back to my head, if I was to continue doing this, the ear, we can simplify the ear down maybe into calling it a cylinder with a big cut in it for that ear thing. But then it shape welds into the side of the head. So that's like the side plane of that cylinder that comes down. I'm sort of beveling these things, which is just because I've drawn enough heads to know what I'm doing. Even the idea of an eye is something that is much more complex. But what do we have with an eye? Can we think of eyes as construction? Yeah, so like an eye, basically a big sphere, right? So if I had something like this, I like drawing these center lines on spheres as well, because I can just think of this as like the center line, the eye line, and the ear line. And you can imagine an arrow pointing out from this, representing that middle point. So an eye, if you imagine it like this, that's the center of it. That's like the Death Star, little dot in the Death Star. And then what is an eyelid? Well, an eyelid is basically a secondary sphere that's kind of conforming to this. So I might imagine this being a contour that goes up around my bottom eyelid, and then in, and then up and around, and then out, and then back up and around for this upper eyelid. So then when it's time to render it, what do we have? Well, we have this bottom of the top eyelid, which being the underside of a plane, if the light source is coming from over here, it's casting a shadow downward. And then similarly, this bottom eyelid, this first little bit of construction here, where we're going like that and then up and around, this lip of the bottom eyelid is pointing upwards. So if the light source is coming there, it's going to be lit on that side and then shaded on this side. So when I draw something like this guy, a lot of times I might think of the overall angle that he's going. So we see here that we're kind of looking down on this head. So we probably wouldn't see much of the underside of the upper eyelid because it's below us. But we might see some of the shadow that it's casting. But this upper eyelid, or this bottom eyelid, I could draw that upper plane. And then suddenly, oh, it's kind of starting to show up, right? Similarly, this bottom or this upper lip is going to cast a shadow down. We see the upper side of this top lip, and then it casts another shadow down. Maybe the nose is casting a shadow. These are all on the downward facing plane. Didn't really follow my contours well there. So I can draw shadows there, so on and so forth. So construction is a really handy tool. I want you to practice being gestural about it. Be a little silly with it. Don't draw a perspective grid every time you need it. And going back to this perspective grid idea, if the worst possible cube we can draw is something that breaks this ortho or this iso cube, the worst possible cube we could have would be one that absolutely does not conform to any of this perspective rules. So like if this is the middle of it, this is like as anti-cube as we can get. But similarly, let's just draw a pure triangle. Pure triangle. In other words, practically a three-point perspective. So what if I just draw three lines inside of this? Doesn't this kind of feel like a cube, even though it's a big triangle? So it's like we're drawing the extremities of this perspective. And more perspective feels a lot better than less perspective. I think the one other thing about construction I would say is just consider how can you simplify things into the smallest version of it. So for instance, let's draw a car as simple as possible. This car's on the street. What does it look like? Well, it's a box. It's longer than it is wide, and it's wider than it is tall, right? Maybe I go a little more. By the way, you notice how fast I move my arm. If I do it wrong, let's just go to the next drawing. So if that's the start of it, I can think of this construction being something that goes also like that for the side. So we might think of this as something where like the car is actually like 3 spheres that are kind of grouping together. This is more like gesture drawing, where I'm trying to be fluid and smooth first. I can always get rigid later. And there's all sorts of hints in design for how things have contours, even if they don't necessarily say it. So now I've got this cube that represents these things all at once. But I've also got maybe windshield wipers or a hood ornament. And suddenly this represents the center, right? I love when students draw cars, because if they love cars, they like really love cars. It's fun. It's always fun seeing what people like by experiencing their drawings, you know. So similarly, if this is that center line going up here, there's our car's faceplate. And these wheels are just now a form within a form within a form as well. I'm thinking of them as now their own little cylinders inside of this box that represents the overall car. And then cast a shadow. Oh yeah, grounding shadows always works. Construction isn't the only way to draw. I don't even know if it's my favorite way to draw. I don't know if I have a favorite way to draw. I kind of like them all. But the one thing I would say about it is it's helpful when you don't understand why something isn't working. And so you can always go back to it, and it might help you with things like characters or buildings or vehicles. Anything you're trying to draw, it's basically an object. And it's made out